Are you familiar with the Kurt Vonnegut fortune versus misfortune scale?
Now that you mention it, I vaguely recall it, but I don't recall it in detail. Go ahead, explain it.
So for those that don't or who aren't familiar, basically Vonnegut had this scale where he measured cultures' ideas on fortune versus misfortune, and what he found was that there were repeating patterns. It was very mathematical. It wasn't so much of tropes, but it was more mathematical. Like this is a common scale. Like this story of a princess has a fortune, it goes to a misfortune. And Vonnegut basically attested that the best stories are stories that are a straight line, where you have to create whether or not it's a good or a bad sort of situation. And I thought that what was it called? Not I mean, it's a famous one. I was trying to figure it out.
Slaughterhouse Five.
Yeah, that's the one. I read that a long time ago, but from what I remember, I thought Billy Pilgrim. I thought that whole situation, for example, like we're talking about like art and interpretation. I thought that his life, as terrible as it was, I thought that there were some good parts to his life as well. Like he makes money, isn't he? Like
He becomes wealthy. Well, Vonnegut, to put that into different perspective, Vonnegut has one of the best takedowns of someone of Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell with the monomyth and all this stuff. And Vonnegut, I remember seeing an interview maybe 30 years ago on PBS with Vonnegut. He had the best put down ever of Campbell. He said, "Oh, that's the guy who spent the whole lifetime figuring out that heroes get into trouble and then get out of trouble."
well, but that's another thing too, because Campbell is taught everywhere. Like I learned about him in middle school. I learned about him in high school, colleges. I think there was like
A
maybe even
total
like
fraud, an intellectual fraud.
this is. I love to know how so is he a fraud? Like in what way?
Because he states the obvious. And this is what happens with any person who's bullshitting someone. Whether you're a drug dealer, whether you're a fraud, whether you're a televangelist, whether you're a politician, is you give people a little bit of the truth, or you give people a little bit of what they want or think that they know to make them feel good, and then you tell them a lot of shit. Another thing Campbell put on the table was, oh, there are only X amount of stories, 3 types of stories, 7 types of stories, and many people have other come up with other names. It's sort of like people think about gender. There's 127 types of gender or whatnot. First off, as far as stories go, if you're trying to say there's only one story, the hero gets into trouble, out of story, or there's only 5 or 7 or 11 types of stories, you're stupid. Because I can take a story. I've done whole plays where you have a character maybe just sitting and thinking about something, or maybe sees a cricket or a praying mantis out his window, and that generates something. I have a story that I've mentioned a few times in interviews I've done elsewhere and have sent around to people. In one of my books, I have one of my short story books. I have a story called "Elements of a Story," and I wrote this because about 7, 8 years ago, a guy who was on my Cosmoetica E-list, whose name I forget, he actually wrote a pretty good little novel, was asking me, how do I write this story or what? And I said, go out, list things that happen, and then think. And so in this Elements of a Story, it starts out with one of my great characters called Bit von Rheingold, who's this Jewish dwarf pornographer who appears in several books and whatnot. But after he's doing, the story starts out with him doing a DVD commentary, and then it fades to the woman listening to, a critic listening to it, I think. And we get the speaker of the story talking about something that Jessica and I did when I wrote the story. We went out driving here in Texas, and we saw some geese at a pond. We saw a kid coming out of a driveway with a car. We saw just these very mundane things. So ask yourself questions. How can I make a story out of this? Think about if you ever went to a restaurant. Now with COVID, it's difficult, but you're sitting at a restaurant. You're with your girlfriend or your parents or a bunch of guys you hang out with, and there are 5 of you, and there's 20 other people in the restaurant. 25 people plus the servers, so 30 people. In all of known history, this will be the only time, most likely, the only time that all 25 or 30 of those people are going to be in that restaurant at the same time. Question, how did they get there? All of them have a story. You might have had polio when you were a little kid and spent 3 years rehabbing. I'm going back too many decades, but you might have had some injury that you're rehabbing from. Your best friend may have just broken up with his girlfriend. The waitress that's serving you just had a kid out of wedlock and gave it up for adoption. Just think about these things. Why are people doing what they're doing? In the corner of the restaurant, there's an old man scribbling in a notebook. Is he a poet taking notes for his next poem, even if it's a terrible poem? Or is he just an obsessive compulsive who's lusting after the waitress who's 40 years younger than him because that waitress has a nice ass and he hasn't had ass for 30 years? These are the things that make us. But this isn't the hero gets into trouble or out of trouble. There's no hero in the story. You don't have to have a hero. I think I sent you my heroic trilogy. If you read those 3 books, the subtitles of those 3 books are the hero, the anti-hero, and the superhero. And I totally that trilogy could be called the Destruction of Joseph Campbell trilogy, because everything that Campbell ever said is basically bullshit, and it's a coin flip as to who has been a more malignant and a more terrible intellectual influence on the arts of the last 40 years, Harold Bloom or Joseph Campbell, because both of them are frauds. Both of them don't know what the fuck they're talking about. If you're intelligent and you read their writing, it's easy to pick apart. And I think Campbell died before I had Cosmoetica. I think he died about 20 years ago.
He died in, I think, the 80s.
He did. Okay. So, but I know I a few times early on in Cosmoetica, I had contacted Harold Bloom and asked him if he wanted to, talk or debate about it. He wouldn't, because even in just my initial emails, it was obvious he's one of these people who's about himself and he's not about the interests of something beyond himself. I'm going to make a list. Shakespeare created him. No, Shakespeare wrote some great plays. He wrote about 7 or 8 great plays out of 37. He wrote about 7 or 8 great sonnets. Maybe you can argue 12, 15, 16 if you're a real Shakespearean out of 154. And his 2 long poems absolutely suck. Is Shakespeare a great writer? Sure. But, I'm not going to be like Mark Twain or anyone saying he wasn't a great writer. But and forget about whether he was gay or not, or whether he was Shakespeare or not. But he also wrote a lot of shit. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you are actually not acknowledging the stuff that was great. Because in order to look at his work, or the work of any artist, you have to be able to say, this worked, that didn't work. This worked 3/4 of the way and failed in a quarter. A quarter of it has issues of some sort. And so when you deal with a Howard Bloom or Campbell, they're just such bullshitters and frauds.